Let's go to the next slide. So you got the helpers of the dragon. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power, and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it, every one whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to the earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So, we start to see here some of the helpers of the dragon, which, as I stated before, in subsequent visions as we go through Revelation, we'll actually see specifically their downfall in more detail. But first, the first beast we see is the beast that rises out of the sea. This beast is given authority by the dragon and seems to be a combination of the beasts that are described by Daniel in his visions. So all the animals that are used in the vision of Daniel to describe the nations that were going to take over Israel are all sort of combined together to create this beast. This combination displays for us that this beast represents the earthly governments and authorities that persecute the church. So this isn't a singular government that's going to exist, or has existed, or is existing. It represents all authorities and all governments that come to persecute the church. That's why it's a sort of mixture of all the previous beasts that represented governments, because it represents all the governments that come to persecute. We also see here that those who are not of God's elect will worship and side with this beast, so that those who and we later see, or we also see that they receive a mark on their hand or their head showing that who they worship, that they worship this beast. So essentially those who side, who are the sealed of God, the elect of God, will worship God. But those who don't worship God and who are not the elect of God will side with the authorities and the powers that are meant to persecute the church and go against it. This is the great threat, which is why John says, here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Because he describes this beast as being great and powerful, which is obvious, being that it's the governments and the authorities that the church has to face. The beast is also described as having a mortal wound on its head that is healed. Most of what I could find about this subject had to do with what is thought to be, what John is intending here is that the mortal wound may represent the death of Emperor Nero. Because right before John was exiled to the Isle of Patmos, they went through intense persecution by the Emperor Nero. Then the Emperor Nero kills himself, and the persecution stops for a short while. Yes. So the persecution stops for a while when Emperor Nero kills himself. But then after that short period of rest, essentially, that short period of peace, Emperor Domitian takes place. And he reincites the persecution. And so the mortal wound... Do what? Emperor Nero. And after he died, there was persecution stopped for a while, and then the next emperor took place, and persecution stepped right back in, and so this mortal wound the mortal wound is taken, and then the dragon's head heals from this wound, which is initially just saying that there may be times where political leaders either don't persecute or die, and the persecution stops, but ultimately this beast will heal and persecution will reinstate again. So there's periods where it seems like it died, but then it comes back and it heals. That's essentially the idea. Can you change slides for me? Thank you. So that takes us to the second beast. So the second beast comes out of the land, and this beast is the false prophet. He is described as a lamb with 2 horns, and his voice is like a dragon. It's interesting that he's described this way. It's kind of the lamb or the wolves in sheep clothing kind of imagery you're getting here, right? So this false prophet is essentially stating this represents all the false religions and the false philosophies that try to look like our Savior, but secretly is concealing the dragon. So on the surface, they look, these other religions and these other philosophies and these other false prophets or false teachings, on the surface look good. They may teach good things, but secretly they're concealing the dragon, and ultimately they're pointing you to worship the dragon and to worship the beast and the government that is persecuting. I would say that this is very easy to see when it comes to most religions, right? What is often told in our society today is, well, don't all religions just teach the same thing? Just be kind to each other, be nice to each other. But that's not true. Not all the other religions do not teach of our Savior, are not connected to our Savior. They are false religions. They are false prophets trying to imitate the Savior, but ultimately can't save. They just lead to destruction. And this beast is ultimately just going to turn you to worship of the first beast and ultimately the dragon. And so after this, can you go to the next slide for me? Thank you. Lastly, we see that those who do not have the seal of God on them will have the mark of the beast on them. And real quickly, I want to talk about one thing that I found interesting, is that he talks about that the people who will worship the beast is everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was the slain. This means that the common imagery that we like to have when it comes to the Lamb's book of life is that either Jesus is up there or an angel or whatever is up there with his big book open, and as people are saved, he's writing people's names in it. It's typically the imagery we like to have. But here, we see that that's not the case, that God's elect have been elected before the foundation of the world. Those who are to be saved will be saved. Not one will be lost. The book has already been written. The Lamb's Book of Life has already been written before we ever existed. And I just found that an interesting thing to see, because the common idea of it is that it's always being added to, but it's not always being added to, that the elect are the elect. And not one person that is in the Lamb's Book of Life will be lost.
Well, it proves that you can't save yourself also.
Do what?
It proves that you can't save yourself also.
Yeah, and it proves that I can't save myself. I can't do it. God has to do it for me. But we see this as in the... Thank you. Thank you. So we see the contrast of this, though, from those who are sealed of God, who don't worship the beast, are the people who worship the beast. These people have the mark of the beast on them. This mark is different from what we see being put on the people who are the elect of God. The elect of God are sealed by God, which gives us the implication of like a royal seals, giving the authority of God stamped on them, the protection of God stamped on them, that these are valued by the king and by God. The people who are ownership of the beast have a mark. These would be the same type of mark that you would put on a slave to show ownership. So it shows that the people that have the mark of the beast are ultimately just enslaved to the beast, that they do not belong to anyone else but him. It is seen that throughout history, there is points where those who are believers are restricted from buying and selling because of this persecution. And so when it talks about the mark of the beast, that those who don't have the mark won't have the ability to commerce, to buy or sell, that we do see this historically happening, that through persecution, many, many Christians throughout history have been forced into poverty, unable to provide for themselves barely, or be able to buy food, or have the same luxuries as those who do not profess Christianity. And this is what it's displaying to that. And then lastly, we have the number itself, which everyone knows the number, 666, right? 666. Yeah, everyone's terrified of the number. So if you're driving down the road and your speedometer hits, if your mileage thing hits 666, pump the gas so you can get to 667, right? But...
New Colorado.
Didn't a lady take Monster, the Monster brand, to court because, like, they're in, if you take, like, the three little, like, curves and make it, like, it's the symbol for 6, and since there's three little, whatever that is, it spells 666, so it's like the devil.
I don't know.
I'm pretty sure someone did take, like, Monster, or they were, like, trying to, like, ran against Monster, like, don't buy it, it's Satan.
But the number 666, what does it represent? Ultimately, the number 666 represents the failure of man. Because as we've looked through the Bible, or through especially Revelation, what does 7 represent? Completion, holiness, God's work. It's always completed in 7s. So anything that falls short of that completion is a failure. 6. But 6 doesn't only mean that they failed, it means that Satan has failed and failed and failed. It's ultimately Satan has really, really failed. He has not made it. That those who have the mark of the beast have failed. There is no reaching beyond that. And it's important for us to know that those who have the seal of God, we have the rest of having the seal of our Savior put on us. But those who have the mark of the beast, They just have the number of a man. And that's 666, which is failure. So that you cannot see success without Christ. That you cannot reach salvation without him. That any of those that try to do it any other way will not.